This week on The Futurists, Brett King and
Rob Tercek. Ultimately, my concern is that the core mechanism here as to whether AI is going to replace humans in the workforce is how capitalism itself works. Is since the 1960s, the overriding economic driver has been increasing productivity. The ultimate tool to increase productivity is to remove humans from the labor force.
Well, welcome back, world travelers. Such a pleasure to see you again. Brett, I haven't seen you in weeks.
Yeah, we haven't done a show together for a while. You know, Katie and I had that one with the NYU professors talking about AI regulation that we did. And, I ended up, we're having Mark Buckley at my apartment in Bangkok, and we did a live recording there. But you and I haven't done a show for a few weeks together.
I mean, you have been on the road nonstop. We both travel a lot, but you win the prize because where are you now? Like, tell me what place you're at.
I'm in Chisinau in Moldova. So I just arrived. Yeah, I literally arrived about an hour and a half ago. Came via Istanbul from Bangkok. I'd been in Bangkok for less than 48 hours from my trip previously, which was to Toronto for Cybos, where we did the Future of Money panel there. And then before that, the weekend before that, I was in Riyadh in Saudi. So yeah, I've been all over the shop.
You're bouncing around. You know, one of the things you notice when you travel around is when you finally do make it back to the United States, it feels like you're going back in time to the 1930s, doesn't it?
Particularly Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing is, having lived in New York as a New Yorker, but someone that travels all over, the infrastructure in the US might have been absolutely state of the art in the 1970s, but in an absolute free market, there's not incentive to upgrade all of that infrastructure because most of it's privatized, right? Whereas if you go to places like China, who are older than the United States, or even Thailand, where I am now, you've got massive infrastructure projects happening all the time right now. Fast rail, improvement of the electricity grid, all of these things are happening. There's just not the political, incentive in the sort of absolute free market economy that the US has. That's resulted in the fact that, for many Americans, now the quality of life in terms of things like basic access to healthcare and education and so forth has deteriorated over time.
Yeah,
compared with what's happening offshore. Yeah,
education standards are down. Certainly our transportation infrastructure leaves a lot to be desired.
Look how many derailments there are annually.
1,000 a year
for trains. It's crazy
number. Yeah, it's true. No, in terms of rail, we really do look like an emerging market or a third world country.
Since 2011, China has put in place 38,000 kilometers of fast rail.
Yeah.
And we can't even get, Los Angeles to San Francisco built in the same.
A big reason for that is our political system has so many checks and balances that it's pretty easy for any one group or even any one politician to stop things in their tracks. And that was by design. Yeah. Right? So when they started the country in the 1700s, the concern was that the concentration of power. So they built a lot of veto power into each level of government. But the problem now is government's lost its ability to get anything done. People can stop a project. So these big infrastructure projects require community engagement. They require private sector to work with public sector and so on. It's very hard to build.
And require consensus.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to achieve, at least in this country. And it doesn't help when you've got at least one political party that's not even dealing with full deck of reality. So I thought it'd be fun for us to catch up on the news since I haven't spoken to you in quite some time. And there's a lot of, like what has happened in the last couple of months has been just extraordinary. I guess one of the news stories that we covered a while ago, about 6 months ago, was this call for a pause in AI research. If you remember, actually, you remember it well because you were one of the 2,000 people who signed.
I did sign on. Letter. I mean, I expressed my reservations. In fact, I wrote an article about it, you might recall, which said the AI pause is bullshit.
You signed it anyway.
Yeah, but I signed it because, it's the best thing that we had available right now to sort of think about regulation. But, obviously, I've got concerns about AI moving ahead without, ethical guardrails, without this sort of core regulation. Europe has had a shot at it. China has had a shot at it. But, beyond Biden forming sort of a regulatory think tank to sort of look at the potential of creating regulation, the US is, again, sort of looking really for the free market to define the alignment of AI to human society. And as we know, that has some significant issues, because we wouldn't have climate change if we didn't have that same mechanism in place in respect to fossil fuel usage.
Well, it's very easy to, as you say, to break the consensus, right? So our Congress is gridlocked to begin with. It's almost evenly split in both houses. And in addition, nobody wins. There's no advocate for the future, right? There's nobody lobbying for the future, but there's plenty of people who are lobbying for the past, and they're well funded. And so they can derail that kind of regulation however they wish. Now, let's talk about what's occurred in the last 6 months. So the letter went out 6 months ago. Some people were derisive and they said it won't accomplish anything. Other people, like Gary Marcus, wrote a good piece today. He was one of the principal people behind that letter.
Yeah,
he felt it was effective. He said, look, we're already having a regulation discussion, which we might not have had. And Max Tegmark, who was kind of the orchestrator of the letter, MIT researcher in artificial intelligence, he also felt like it was productive. So in the last 6 months, here are some of the things that have happened. There's a lot. We now have multimodal LLMs, right? So now you can communicate, you can talk to the Chat GPT, which really starts to present the interesting possibility of using it like an AI assistant on your phone. That's really new. Like that just came out now. Open source large language models have proliferated around the globe, meaning that innovation is happening everywhere and small teams can access those models. They don't have to spend a huge fortune on training them. There have been a flurry of lawsuits ever since we've been covering the topic on this show for a while, but there have been a flurry of lawsuits, principally copyright infringement lawsuits filed here in the US and elsewhere, different governments in different jurisdictions around the world on that topic. There's been an outcry from creative professionals around the world because their writing, their work is the subject matter that the LLMs are trained on.
Right, including the Hollywood writers' strike is most notable.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Let's bookmark that because that's a whole other topic, the labor and the strikes and so on, because there's a lot of news there. Now, one thing did get paused. I was interested to read about this. OpenAI did actually pause the work on training their latest large language model, which is GPT-5. Now, they say it has nothing to do with the letter. We'll see. I don't know about that. They say the rumor, actually, they haven't said this. The rumor is that they weren't getting the results they wanted, and it was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train. And there's some questions about OpenAI's ability to keep burning hundreds of millions of dollars out of whack just to keep their model ahead of the rest of the pack.
Yeah, I don't think people really understand how labor intensive training these LLMs is. You know, the fact that you've just got to hire a lot of bodies to churn through a ton of data to feed into the engines. You know, it's a very, it's not that these LLMs go out and look at the internet and learn all of a sudden. You know, it's a much more deliberate than that, especially if you want some sort of ethical filtering to the data.
Yeah. So on that note, OpenAI has been using workers in Kenya who are paid $2 an hour to do human reinforcement of the training. So there's like a whole human component to this. These are not self-taught machines. They're tutored by human beings who aren't paid very well. Now, Sam Altman.
Well, I think a lot of people, before you continue with that, I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand, how machine learning works, because I hear a lot of people talking about AI competing with humans and so forth, and framing it in that way. And ultimately, I think that's fair. But to think about these AI as sort of coming up with these concepts independently, that's actually not what's happening. What's happening is it's combing through all of this human language, stuff that we've written, stuff that we've said, and it's condensing that down to these models in terms of, how language works. And when you look at things like diagnostics in the medical field, it's looking at all of the work that diagnosticians have done, radar technicians, oncologists, and so forth, that is compressing all of that human knowledge and experience and finding those patterns, that enable good diagnosis. And in doing so, what it does is it condenses a broad range of human activity and behavior. So essentially what you get is sort of a condensed version of all the best human application at that task. Now, it's not the same for language processing and ChatGPT, because as we know, language it has a lot of variability to it. But for tasks like that, we are seeing these machines now perform at better rates, in fields like diagnosis, than humans. And it's not because the machines are better. It's just that it's condensed all of the human knowledge into sort of an actionable framework. Yeah, exactly.
Like a greatest hits album at your fingertips, or a cheat guide, things that humans have been using for a long time to get an advantage or get a leg up. Also useful for drug discovery, useful for translation. I get the people who are concerned about the threat. And I think, as like Amir Gavi said when we interviewed him a month ago, he said most of the concerns boil down to people's fear that they're going to be replaced, people's fear that they'll be obsolete. And Brett, my observation there is that's a generational fear. When I talk to younger people, I don't get that impression. People under 30 are embracing these tools and they welcome them, or they're indifferent to it, but they'll use them. It's older people who feel like, well, I've accomplished a lot in my life and I've mastered this particular domain. And now it's my time to basically ride it out, to use my expertise, and they're feeling threatened. They're feeling they might get displaced. The practical reality is that no one yet has lost their job to any of these tools. I've heard from some people who say, well, graphic designers or people on Fiverr, that do job work, that they're getting displaced. I don't know if that's actually true or not. But in terms of any professional that I've spoken to, the way people are using these tools is as like an accelerator. They're using it like a really smart personal assistant.
No, I look, I've talked about the 4 phases of AI integration, and I frame it this way. The first phase is alignment, where we figure out how AI should fit in society, and that's going to continue for some time. Second phase is the advisory phase, where we use AI to augment advice. So this is AI-powered humans or AI-assisted humans, and we do that until such point where the AI models get good enough to eliminate the human from that advice piece, or where we can let AIs act on our behalf. So this is the agency phase. Now, we're probably not going to get into this agency phase of AI where we have these AIs, autonomously acting, on our behalf as examples, till the early part of next decade. But at that point, it's a lot more binary. Right. Mm-hmm. In that, jobs where today humans still have value because of information asymmetry, that is, they know more about a topic than you do, they're the ones at the highest risk from the agency phase, because that's really where the AI is going to start to attack. So I don't think right now you can make a case that AI is producing broad technology unemployment, but that certainly won't be the case in the mid-2030s, right? So, we've got a period of time to prepare for that. The argument that the market makes, and the argument that and this is a very good point why the AI pause didn't make significant progress. It might have ticked a few boxes, but ultimately my concern, and I've expressed on the show before, is that the core mechanism here as to whether AI is going to replace humans in the workforce is how capitalism itself works. Mm-hmm. Is since the 1960s, the overriding economic driver has been increasing productivity. The ultimate tool to increase productivity is to remove humans from the labor force, right, in production. And there is nothing in the model of capitalism today that says we should value a human worker over an algorithm. And that when we look at why the AI pause letter didn't produce a wave of rapid regulation, and really stop development of AI, is because ultimately whether AI is going to be implemented and have an effect on employment is up to the market. It's not up to the government today.
Well, it could be. It's a choice, right? And we've been conditioned.
Right. It's a policy choice,
years.
right?
Yeah. For about 50 years, we've been conditioned this idea that government shouldn't intervene in markets. Of course, it does all the time, but it does so in ways that preserve the status quo and give companies, private sector companies, free reign to make decisions. Now, it's certainly possible to conceive of a government that does actively intervene in the private sector and in markets.
China. EU, yeah,
EU. It's also important for people listening to recognize that the market is not society. The market is a subset of society, but we tend to run the United States as if the market is the whole of society. There's just a lot of social functions that don't really work in a marketplace, and we need to recognize. I think we need to recognize that policy needs to recognize that. Now, this brings up the adjacent topic, which you teased already, which is strikes. We should probably jump into that after the break. Should we take a little break and then come back and take it up with the strikes, labor action?
Sure. Yeah, let's take a break. You're listening to The Futurists with myself, Brett King, and Rob Tercek. We'll be right back after this break. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcasts, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
All right. Hey, listen, you're back and you're listening to The Futurists with me, Rob Tercek, and my co-host, Brett King, who's coming to us from Moldova. So tell me, what's the weather like in Moldova?
Well, it's pretty warm. It's about 29 degrees Celsius today. So, in the 80s. It's funny, though, I've been spending the last few months in Thailand. So I was outside in Thailand the other day and it was raining. And it was down to about 26 degrees Celsius. And I was like, oh, God, I need a jacket. It's cold, because your blood thins out over
It's
time.
True. So, you get conditioned to that constant humidity. That's definitely true. While Sam Altman has been on the CEO of OpenAI has been on a nonstop world tour to reach out proactively to governments to talk about regulation, there's a lot of speculation that the kind of regulation he's pushing for is not the kind that'll favor workers or those who are threatened by displacement. The speculation is that he's looking to create a licensing regimen that would essentially entrench the leading AI companies. And we've seen some trends towards that, by the way, in the last few months. For instance, just last week, Amazon announced that they're going to invest up to $4 billion in Anthropic, which is a competitor to OpenAI. It was founded by a couple of the team from OpenAI. It's an alternative approach. They have a thing called constitutional AI, where you can set some values, you can actually incorporate what we think are human values. Interesting notion. Amazon's going to make that available to their cloud customers, which makes a good deal of sense. So you're starting to see the emergence then of these little blocks, right? One block is DeepMind and Google. Another block is Microsoft and OpenAI. And another block now is Anthropic and Amazon. And these are the big cloud vendors, the big technology companies teaming up with their pet AI shop. And you'll start to see those things integrated. And that suggests the market dominance is already underway. Now, counteracting that, of course, is source stuff.
Well, I am reminded of... you ever watch Star Trek: Next Generation?
Yes, that was a heck of a transition there.
No. I'm just saying because Data often referred to his ethical subroutines, right?
Right.
And I ultimately think that we need something like that. And now the EU has taken sort of a two-tier approach to the system, that there are core ethics and then there are other behaviors that can be, but the core ethics are sort of critical elements of regulation. And I think I tend to, I think that makes the most sense for now until we can actually sort of encode a regulatory AI that creates the sort of ethical subroutines.
But you're talking about coding human values, and the big question there is
we can't even agree on human values amongst
that is a political debate, my friend.
Oh,
Holy cow!
Goodness.
we're in no position.
Maybe we
in this
get the
country.
Dalai Lama to write the ethics code. I don't know. It's
You know what?
yeah.
Maybe it's for the best that the United States cannot regulate its way out of this problem right now. That we're so incapable because of gridlock. Because
Because that allows the EU and others to take the leadership. We saw that with the GDPR, with the data regulations, and
yeah, that's true.
What is happening now around the world when you look at CBDCs and crypto, when you look at data protection ordinances and things like that. We are seeing regulation develop globally now, because what is happening is regulators have to move quickly. And so instead of reinventing the wheel, they'll take the EU regulation and incorporate that, into their localized regulation. So when people talk about global government and things like that, the fact is it's already becoming clear that regulation is becoming globalized.
100%. Also, what's the WTO? Like, the World Trade Organization is a global government. What WTO can sanction a country if that's not a global government. Now, countries opt into that, but countries want to be a part of that because it's about free trade. You may recall when we interviewed Stefan Lindstrom from Finland, he pointed out that American
Minister of the Future, right?
That's right. He pointed out that the American government has outsourced regulation to the EU, and I think that's a great way to put it. We can't agree on anything here. Yeah. We just punt.
But it's not by intent. Right,
it's just default.
It's by default. Right,
that's exactly right. But it's kind of funny. Now, the EU regulation is interesting because they have identified a couple critical sectors. So anything that involves life and death, anything that involves military or national security, there the AI is going to be strictly regulated. But when it comes down to consumer grade AIs, for consumers to talk to, say like a chat assistant or something, they're going to have very light regulation. So what they're trying to do is they don't want to over-regulate preemptorily. Americans are concerned.
Well, I think
space.
Right, but I think what you'd see in America, as we see with a lot of regulations, is ultimately who is going to be writing regulations for AI in the States? Isn't it going to be people like Sam Altman?
He's pushing hard for it, right? And
right. That's
his charm.
Look at who writes regulation on drugs. It's the big pharma. Who writes regulations on use of fossil fuels? It's big oil, right? It's like that's
true. Yeah, that's true. You get as much regulation as you pay for in the United States. Unfortunately.
So true.
Okay, so let's talk about who's not at the table right now. The people who haven't been represented in this conversation at all are workers. And you've alluded to it a couple of times. Of course, you've written about this eloquently in the past. The notion of technological displacement of workers. And that's a big concern people had. By the way, it's not new. It's been around for 100 years. Actually, you go all the way back to the Luddites, I suppose you can say. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, workers have been concerned.
Ned Ludd.
Yeah, concerned about getting displaced, right? We had this debate in the United States in the 1940s when automation came to factories. Because in the 20s, workers had a great deal of autonomy in the factory. The management of the factory barely came into the factories. But then they started bringing in machines that could replace humans. And the workers started to do sabotage at that time as well, where they would start to break the machines in a way that was kind of reminiscent of the Luddites. So here we are today, and people are worried about AI. And the people who have been leading the charge, weirdly, I think, but in a really kind of valiant way, is the Writers Guild of America, the WGA. These are the screenwriters in New York and Los Angeles. And they've been on strike. They were on strike for nearly 150 days. The strike was just settled yesterday.
It's a long time. And Bill Maher caved and Drew Barrymore caved, to the pressure. They were going to bring back their shows. They didn't. That seemed to be a turning point because
it's a lot of solidarity, I think. And the Screen Actors Guild has been right alongside protesting. For those who aren't in Los Angeles or New York, every day there have been strikers surrounding the movie studios and motion picture companies protesting quite lively. Actually, it's kind of a fresh reminder. At least when I was a kid, there were strikes all the time in the 1970s.
Yes.
We had a very vibrant labor movement. Under President Reagan in the 80s, we kind of broke the spine.
Well, so it wasn't just Reagan. I mean, I talk about this in Techno-Socialism. It was also, of course, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher in the UK that kicked it off. And, if you look at what happened, the 1970s was this movement. Thatcher and Reagan really attacked the unions and collective bargaining. They said the unions were, holding the rest of the market at with a gun to their heads and holding them hostage and so forth. And essentially Thatcher and Reagan won that battle, and they reduced the power of collective bargaining and the trade unions overall. The net net effect of that was that real wage growth stopped.
That's
and if
right.
you look at real wage growth since the 1980s onwards in the United States, in the UK, and Australia, where I'm from, real wage growth has been absent. And there's an argument to be made that the lack of, the legislation that reduced the power of trade unions and collective bargaining is exactly why we haven't had real wage growth in countries like the States.
That's correct. I think there's a lot to that, a lot of merit to that. And of course, there's also an economic incentive for companies to invest in technology, right? And so that's capital investment. They can write that off. And it's what they call capital bias technological change, right? Where the more you invest in technology, the more returns go to capital and not to labor. So that's going
so there's actually hard metrics on this today.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the best blue chip companies of the 1960s and 1970s, and you look at how the amount of profit per employee that was generated, and you look at organizations like Apple and Facebook and Tesla is not a great example, but these tech companies, they are earning 10 times more per employee, inflation adjusted, than these 1960s or 1970s based companies. And that's because there's a lot less employees. Yeah. It's like the world's being vaporized, Robert.
Well, yeah, the other point is that those companies can scale to planetary size, right? That previously wasn't possible in the era of physical goods and manufacturing. But now they can. Now there's a lot of labor movements happening. So I think people have been inspired by the Writers Guild. By the way, they won. This is really remarkable because even at the time, while I'm a supporter of the Writers Guild, I thought, well, they're doomed, right? AI is coming. The movie studios are on the defensive. They're getting attacked by big tech. They are going to have to automate their way out of this problem. But the writers held in there. They got support from other unions, the Teamsters Union, IATSE, which is the theatrical workers, the screen actors, even the Directors Guild for a little while was supporting them. And as a result, they won. And they got almost everything they asked for. They got an increase in residual payments or bonuses based on streaming that they didn't have before. They got guarantees about the minimum number of workers who can be hired on a show so that you can't expect a single writer to do a whole show. That's a big change. They never had that before. And then perhaps most importantly, they won on the artificial intelligence, which was one of the very, very contentious points. Now, people get this wrong, so I want to take a second to explain it. Some people say the Writers Guild was against artificial intelligence. And if you looked at the signs that the protesters had, or the strikers had, sometimes you got that impression, like, they were against ChatGPT. The fact is the Guild's not against automation. It's not against AI in any way. They just don't want it to be forced on them, which is very similar, by the way, to the complaint of the Luddites. In a weird way, it's like a recap of that. They're like, we'll use AI if we want to use AI, but we don't want someone to force us. And there was one really specific point that was most contentious, and that was, could a producer use something like ChatGPT to generate a script and then hire a member of the Screenwriters Guild, the Writers Guild, to do a polish on that? And if that was possible, that would actually, the writer only gets paid 25% for doing a polish versus what they get paid for an original script. So that would be a way for them to evade a contractual obligation. It was like a loophole that could have undercut the value of a screenwriter. They fought very hard and they won on that point. So no AI can be used in literary material, and you cannot use a script, AI.
But a screenwriter can use AI to generate a script.
That's exactly right. And they're not opposed to, so for instance, there's a lively discussion right now on whether the studios can use the writing to train an LLM, right? That was another contentious issue. And it looks like the studios are going to win on that. Not to replace the writer, but to automate things like the descriptions that go into streaming media services, or the description that goes on a box, those the metadata around the film, I guess. It makes a good deal of sense for that to get automated, or to use that to write, promotional copy, social media.
We're using tools like Opus to take clips from, our show, The Futurists, and create short form video. And it looks at, patterns of listener behavior, or, when you're watching it on YouTube, looks at places that, people highlight and so forth, and looks at natural cadence of language to choose these segments to automatically generate these short form clips. It's a pretty powerful tool. I can see us continuing to use that. It doesn't mean that, we're, as hosts or at the guests, that we're being compromised.
No one's going to
But
interview you with ChatGPT on this show anytime soon.
no. But it's going to take work off someone who's maybe doing social. But it's the social team that's using these tools actually, right?
Well, I was going to say, in a way, it empowers your social team to reach. There's a diversity of platforms. There's way too many social platforms. So how can one person hope to reach them all? So a small team can be more effective. Now, Spotify is using AI, generative AI, to take a podcaster's voice and produce the show in different languages. So it would still be your voice. And they're doing this with the permission of the podcaster.
I'd be cool with that.
Me too. I would love to deliver my show in the Moldovan language, whatever that might be. For instance,
mainly Russian and Romanian here, but yeah.
Oh, okay, fair, great, good. Let's get it out. Well, the Futurists in Russian, and other people are using it for other kinds of translation, automating marketing materials, and so forth. Let's talk about other labor action because, of course, the writers' strike was not the only strike. We've seen attempts to strike against Amazon in their warehouses during the pandemic, and now the auto workers in the United States. The auto workers have gone on strike. So this is a big deal because United Auto Workers is one of the biggest unions in the country. And they are striking.
They're looking for a 40% pay hike. It's over 3 years.
It's a pretty aggressive demand. Auto companies, they had a tough time during the pandemic, but they're back and they're making money now. So this is the right time to ask for it.
Biggest profits that they've done in over a decade. So there's that argument. I see a lot of, I'll use the terminology that Katie uses, which is corpo apologists. Right, on Twitter, mainly on Twitter, actually, less on LinkedIn, but arguing that, that if these striking workers get what they want, it'll be the end of auto manufacturing in the United States.
That argument's overblown. That's
right.
Blown.
Well,
yeah.
So there's two very simple counter arguments to that. One is that German automakers can do that. So does that mean that American automakers are grossly inefficient when compared with German automakers? No one would argue that. And the other piece of this is that Tesla can do it in the United States, but they can do that with high levels of automation applied, and then
that's a really important point.
And this is going to have to be negotiated as part of this.
No, let's talk about Tesla because they're the important company to watch in this space. So while I think it's reasonable to expect Ford and GM to come to some sort of arrangement with their workers, Tesla is an interesting company because it has exactly 0 union workers. It is an auto company in the United States that doesn't hire any union workers. How do they do it? Well, they move their plants to places where they're aggressively anti-union. There is no one United States when it comes to this sort of thing because there are several red states that are very anti-union. For instance, South Carolina is a state that welcomes auto manufacturers. They have been doing a great job. They just landed another plant from Audi in the state of South Carolina. They already have Mercedes-Benz and BMW and Volvo. So they're doing great at attracting European automakers. And part of that is it's a right to work state. So the union doesn't have as much power to shut the place down. And so that diminishes labor's power to bargain. But what it does mean is jobs are created. Now, the leading proponent of this is Elon Musk and Tesla. They are firmly anti-union. So I think what I would say is that as workers try to organize and try to extract more of the profit for labor instead of it flowing back to capital, what that does is it creates an incentive for corporations to relocate to other jurisdictions that might be more favorable. Yes. And we'll see that again. It's like there's
the same thing. I think the same things I think going to happen with mass automation, right? Is you're going to have jurisdictions that are quite happy to have completely autonomous factory operation and others that will prioritize, human labor. We call this, in techno-socialism, when we did the 4 different models, we call this the ladder stand scenario, right? Where jurisdictions would seek to ban the implementation or restrict the implementation of artificial intelligence to favor human workers. The main incentive behind that is essentially that in highly capitalist environments, and particularly in the sort of environment we have in the United States, if you have to create a social safety net for people who are displaced by technology, that is a bigger problem in certain states in the US than it would be displacing the human workers, from a corporate perspective, right? So
also the money that you pay workers circulates in the local economy, so all those
right, machines aren't going to consume. Exactly.
All the workers at the assembly line, they shop in the local grocery store, they use the local dry cleaner, they buy cars in the local dealership and so forth. So the money circulates, and that's a great way to keep a community going. Whereas if it's fully automated, the money goes to shareholders, and it doesn't necessarily stay in the community. You can hollow out a community that way. So watch this space. We're going to surely come back and talk about more labor policy in the future.
We'll be talking about it for the next 20 years.
So Brett, also, it's the 25th anniversary of Google. And the Department of Justice has given the Google not one, but two big presents to commemorate the occasion. They're being sued by the Department of Justice for antitrust in two cases right now. One for search, their dominance of search. And then after that, there'll be another case coming on their dominance in ad serving. And I think it's very difficult for anyone to say that Google's not a monopoly, since they have something like overwhelmingly 90%.
Well, they've already been sued for this in the EU jurisdiction and in the UK separately. So the US is behind on this. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that I guess is the interesting thing. The United States policy on monopoly and antitrust has evolved. A lot of people don't notice this because it's kind of arcane. It's a little like getting into copyright, which is another one of my pet topics.
It's one of your pet
things that I go into, but antitrust law in the United States, the laws are about 100 years old. They're from the 1890s, the Sherman Antitrust Act. They were designed specifically to break up big trusts that were dominating entire industries. Those laws have been kind of dormant in the last 50 years, and that's partly because of the work of the Chicago School of Economists. They came up with a theory called price theory, also known as consumer welfare. The consumer welfare structure of analysis, whereby you say, gee, if there's a monopoly, is it necessarily harming customers? If it's not, the way you would find that is if it's raising its prices and extracting monopoly rent, basically charging a lot for something that it needn't charge such a high price for. Then that would be considered harmful to consumers. Then there would be monopoly action. This idea was formulated in the 1970s, and principally by a guy named Robert Bork, who was once a nominee for the Supreme Court. He's the reason why our Supreme Court nominations are so contentious now. But he was quite an extremist on this, in favor of corporations. People were scared about him being on the Supreme Court for that reason. Anyway, he pushed this concept, and we've been abiding by it ever since, which is basically if there's no high prices, then consumers aren't being harmed. Therefore, the monopoly is not so bad. We can tolerate it. The last big antitrust case in the United States was against Microsoft in 1999. So it's been quite a few years. Now, we have a new head of the Federal Trade Commission, a woman named Lena Khan. 6 years ago, she was a student at Yale Law School, and she wrote an important paper about Amazon with a new theory of antitrust. And her paper talked about how a company like Amazon or any network business has an opportunity to do something that was previously impossible to do. They can provide services for free. And in doing that, they can restructure entire markets and grow to dominance. And of course, we know this because we use the free services every single day, right?
Free delivery.
And so forth, right? And in Amazon's case, they don't really offer a lot of stuff for free, but they do offer low prices. So effectively, they're subsidizing the cost of the goods in order to gain market share. Now, if you looked at all the retailers in the United States, Amazon's a small percentage, about 10% of that. So they're not dominant. But in e-commerce, depending on the way you define the market, they might have a dominating share. And so Lena Khan is now the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission. And yesterday, she filed a major antitrust lawsuit against Amazon. Interestingly, though, it's not arguing that there's
based on these mechanics.
Yeah, what she's arguing in this case is not consumer harm. She's arguing that they've harmed sellers in Amazon Marketplace.
Well, what I want to know, dude, is why aren't we doing this for insulin? I know we've had a price of insulin capped, and so forth, but it's effectively free in the rest of the world.
You're right.
And there are still 1 million Americans that have to ration their insulin. This is 25% of those that have type 1 diabetes in the United States that have to make a decision as to whether they're going to eat and pay the rent or get insulin. And this is an antitrust issue. It's not a monopoly. It's pricing that's agreed on.
Right, an oligopoly that sets the price.
Right, an oligopoly. This is weirdly as much of an issue.
They do it with the connivance and support of the federal government. They do it with the support of Congress.
I know,
This
it's
is what's
crazy.
extraordinary. Now, the Biden administration is trying to do something about the price of drugs, but it's not just insulin, which I agree with you is inhumane and taking advantage. But the United States citizens pay more for drugs of every type than any country in the world. In many cases,
we are twice the OECD average in the United States.
We pay more for healthcare. We pay much more for healthcare. Again, it's a very highly consolidated market. We pay more for broadband, and we have no choices. In many cases, we have a choice of one. The broadband service we get is quite poor relative to other parts of the world. We pay twice or sometimes 3 times as much for mobile phones. We have fewer providers of mobile phones in the United States, mobile phone service, and we pay about twice the price of other countries, sometimes 4 times the price. So it's a great question, right? The United States was founded by people who were anti-monopoly, fiercely anti-monopoly, right? The fight was about the Boston Tea Party was a fight against the English tea company,
against monopolization. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, against monopolies. And yet here we are capitulating to effectively government-sanctioned monopolies. I find it a great paradox. Who knows, Brett? We live in such a world of interesting times and change. I think you get as much government as you pay for in this country, and you get as much justice as you can afford.
Yeah, I mean, someone was commenting on a post that I'd commented on the other day, and they made some comment about their constitutional right for gun ownership, of course. And I was like, what about a constitutional right for health? For a roof over your head, for
clean
food,
water,
access to food, for clean water, for clean air. Why would you prioritize guns over those basic things? And yet the US economy has, we're seeing deterioration in those core elements, affordability of housing, affordability of healthcare, affordability of food. Why, the figures are coming out that, inflation's not a big deal, but so many people are saying, why is it costing me $32 to buy a 6-pack of bananas or whatever it is, right?
That's right. Well, and also your mortgage has gone up, your cost of leasing a car.
It's insane, yeah.
So that people aren't wrong.
Cost of living is just, and again, the real wage growth is a core problem in this. So there is some really, this is not unique to the United States. There are structural problems, in economies all around the world with this now. Inequality is a growing problem. A lot of the reason inequality is growing is because of the increased application of automation, because it does sort of create this, software or AI, in the future will be an AI landlord class, that own the assets that are automating large portions of the economy. Unless you're in that segment, then, you've got to get by with what you can get on a reduced wage structure while the cost of living is increasing and increasing. It's, I just found out a stat, this is going to blow your mind, but, the fastest growing category of housing in the United States, privately owned housing, is privately owned vans. Van life, and so now to buy a van, like a Sprinter van that was $30,000, these things are selling for $100,000 now because of the demand for people wanting to get in a van to live. I mean, van life, it sounds romantic, but the reason people are being pushed into buying a van to live in a van is because the cost of housing is gone out of their reach. Now, in the 1960s, the average American could buy a home, a family of 4, the white picket fence home, on average 3 times the average annual salary in the United States.
Yeah.
But in places like where you live and where I lived in New York, it's 19 or 26 times the average salary now,
But don't forget, in the 1960s, 35% of the American workforce was in a union, in a labor union. Not everybody, but a big chunk, right?
Exactly.
And that managed to reinforce every worker's bargaining position. So by dismantling unions and by accelerating automation, we've managed to degrade labor and thereby the lifestyle and the quality of life for a huge percentage of the population. I'm wondering what the future for this is going to be. We'll definitely cover this topic more in the future.
Look, I'll leave us with this thought because I know we've got to wrap, but ultimately, if you think about the application of artificial intelligence, and this is what I think a lot of people miss. When you look at the 60s, the 1960s and 1970s, the science fiction movies and so forth that depicted robots in society, Rosie the robot, etc. The plan always was for robots to take away menial human labor, housework, working in factories and so forth. So literally for 60 years, technologists have been preparing us that robots are going to take human jobs. That has always been the intent of automation for AI and robotics. And so ultimately, if AI is successful, which I see no reason why it won't be, we have to start dealing with the fact that human labor is no longer a mechanism for the distribution of wealth in society, that we need some other way to do that. Wow. Because the less you can employ human laborers in the workforce, the less effective mechanisms you have for distribution of wealth in society. So this is, I think, the big problem that's coming. That's that even if you can maintain human jobs, you're not going to get paid as much because the most valuable companies will be highly automated. So that is a philosophical change in the way work is relates to society and humanity, and it's a big deal, and it's going to take decades to figure.
In a way, it's tragic that OpenAI didn't stick with its original mission of being truly open, right? Their idea was an open alternative to the big, huge tech companies. Of course, now that's over because they've taken massive investment from Microsoft, and they're now part of the Microsoft world. So they're part of one of the big platforms in a way. But it's too bad, right? Because you could imagine a scenario where small companies could compete by using open tools. Maybe that's still possible because there are other open AI LLMs that are available. But my sense is that those companies will fall behind if this becomes a battle of scale and a battle of service. The companies with the big data centers that are all over the world are going to have a strategic advantage there. So in a way, they'll hasten this issue that you're bringing up.
Yeah, I think there are, I think that the app economy, what we saw with companies being able to, startups being able to create value quickly on the app ecosystem, I think there is the same is going to happen for spatial computing and for AI specialization in these areas where there are commercial opportunities. But as you say, the broader frameworks, industrial level AI and conversational AI built into operating systems and experiences, that's going to be dominated by these oligopolies, as you say.
Well, that is not the world's brightest note to end one of our episodes on. Generally, you're the optimist here. I feel like I'm holding up the optimistic end of the bargain. Brett, it's always a great pleasure to see you. Now, I owe you a conversation about China because there's a lot of misunderstanding here in the U.S. about what's actually happening on the ground. And since you've been there quite often and you have a good perspective on it, very soon, let's record a show where I can ask you, what's the truth about China?
Right. Yeah, that'll be good because this is a conversation that I have frequently online, particularly with Americans, not less so with people in other parts of the world. But, let's definitely get into that. It's something that I'm passionate about.
Super. Well, safe travels to you. I hope it goes well. And I hope you finally get to one time zone and can stay there for a while. Super fun to see you, folks. You've been listening to The Futurists with my co-host, Brett King, and myself, Rob Tercek. And we are very grateful for your listening. Thank you for supporting the show. I want to give a shout out to Kevin Hirschhorn, who's our engineer, and to Elizabeth Severance, our producer, and the whole team at Provoke Media. Thank you all very much for making the show possible. And a big shout out to those fans of the show who've been sharing it on social media and telling their friends about it. We're growing, and that's because of you. We thank you very much for your support. And we will see you soon. In fact, we'll see you
in the future. Sorry.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.